and this is Cassidy, Teal, and Joanna, and we are the board of the cafe group at PAU, which is the Child and Family Emphasis. So essentially what our group focuses on is just finding better ways that we can treat and help children, adolescents, and their families, and seeing them within the greater framework of their environment. And so we were so excited when we saw the movie Inside Out and how the emotional awareness can be taught to children in such a palatable way. And so we're so grateful to the Ekmans and all of the research that they've done that's helped to inform that. And so we were so excited to work with the Compassion Initiative and to plan this event. And we're so grateful to you for coming, because if you didn't come, it wouldn't be a very good event. And so we are so happy to have this day finally come. And without further ado, we would love to introduce the Ekmans.
All right, so just to introduce them, I think most of you know who these people are up here, but just a little bit about Dr. Paul Ekman. He's Professor Emeritus in Psychology at UCSF, and he's the researcher and author best known for furthering our understanding of emotion and deception. He established the universality of some facial expressions, and in a separate line of research, discovered how expressions and gestures may betray a lie. Ekman has authored more than 100 published articles, 14 books, and holds several honorary doctoral degrees. And we're also really lucky to have his daughter, Dr. Eve Ekman, here as well. And Dr. Eve Ekman is currently a postdoctoral scholar at UCSF's Osher Center for Integrative Medicine. Her research interests were inspired by her experience as a medical social worker in the emergency department of San Francisco General Hospital, and by her training in the applied emotion regulation and mindfulness intervention, cultivating emotional balance. So again, we'd love to get a good round of applause for them. We're very honored to have them here. We look forward
to Okay. All right. Do you want to remain sitting? Do you want to stand? Okay. So we're going to give you an overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about 40-45 minutes, including just a live tour through the Atlas of Emotion. And then, as I said, we're going to continue with your questions, which we're very excited to hear about. We're going to give you an introduction, a little bit more, not just kind of about us, but about how our interests led to this Atlas and the context of that. We're then going to give you a little bit on the scientific basis of the project. You already heard that the project was funded and inspired by a spiritual leader, and yet his first directive was, make this based in science. So, given the limited nature of what we actually know about emotions, we have a little bit of science to work from, but we'd like to be very clear with you about that so you have a foundation when explaining to others, your clients or colleagues. Then we're going to tour the Atlas, just check it out a bit, talk about the relationship also with Inside Out, and give you some direction on where to get more resources for that, and then future directions. So our first slide here is for my dad to give you a little background on this early work that led to the Atlas.
Well, that top picture is as I started to walk into the Highlands of New Guinea. When I entered this area of study, such a long time ago, 1966, it was uncertain who was right, Charles Darwin or Margaret Mead. Were expressions universal to the species, product of our evolution, or were they a culture-specific language like other languages? I didn't really care what the answer was. I had no inkling. I just wanted to see if I could settle it. I figured this is sort of going to be the last chance to settle it, and that the crucial sample would be with people who worked from the outside, who never had contact. And I knew from the travels I had already done, I had already worked at 18 countries at that point, studying primarily gesture, not facial expression, that visually isolated cultures were disappearing, and that there was only a year or two left when they would still exist, and where you could use them to answer this question. And by a stroke of good fortune, it's just amazing how many accidents are responsible for what you find, where you go, and what you do. A very close friend said, I know a guy at NIH who's been working in the highlands of New Guinea to study a disease called Kuru that was killing half the people in this particular language group. At that time, there were 300 different languages spoken in Papua New Guinea by groups that had no contact with each other. And so they developed these separate verbal languages. And as it turned out, Carlton Gajdusek, the name of the scientist who did the work on Kuru, recognized that as important as his biological work was documenting a Stone Age culture. And they were still using stone implements. I have in my living room a stone axe that is in use at the time. Amazing. 1967. And still, there were a few places left like that. Now, Gajdusek was in the glory days of NIH, and he had unlimited funding. Really, totally unlimited. So he hired a cinematographer to just make movies of the daily life of people in this culture. And when I went to visit him at NIH, say I heard that you had these films, and he said, here, you want a copy? He said, I've never looked at them, I don't have the time to. But if you want to see them. Well, that immediately answered the questions. Because I never saw anything that I hadn't already seen. There was nothing new. And when I could tell from what occurred before or afterwards, what the signal, what the expression or gesture meant, my interpretation was correct. So now I had the answer, I just didn't have the evidence. Now, if I was an ethologist or an anthropologist, I would have published at that point. Because unverified impressions of a single observer are acceptable as evidence in psychiatry, clinical psychology to some extent, and in anthropology and ethology, not in academic psychology, where we know that observers are biased to see what they're expecting to see or want to see. And you need to get multiple independent observations if you're going to know anything. Well, that means doing science. And so the question was how to do science in this culture. I couldn't give them a questionnaire, no written language. I didn't know their language. Only 1 or 2 people in the world knew their language. But that's what got me in that picture hiking along. Now in the lower picture, that is me too. With on the left you see, on the left, that's what I should have been doing. On the left you see. The muscles as they appear in the anatomy textbooks. At that time, there wasn't a functional anatomy. So it was a anatomy in which muscles were described from cadavers, not in terms of action or function, with guesses that were often inaccurate. Frontalis, which is a band of muscle here, was described as a single muscle in all the anatomy texts. It still is in most, but it isn't, because, now I'll do this for you, I can raise the inner or outer motion, which tells you that it's 2 muscles with separate nerve supply. And if we're going to actually describe facial behavior, which is what I attempted to do there, then we've got to do it in terms of action, what the muscles do.
This then led to looking at facial expression of emotion that didn't necessarily relate to what was being said or what was being described. So with deception, it's not as much about, oh, that expression specifically is one that is a lying expression. It's more, does the facial expression have incongruities with what is being said in the context? So the work kind of naturally evolved that way. This then led to, my dad, he used to say this for a while, he was the only person simultaneously funded by the Defense Department and the Dalai Lama.
Dalai Lama like that.
So there's a broad range of application of these skills, as you can imagine, and I'm sure many of you who in the room has done any kind of micro-expression training or facial expression training. Wow, we have so many more people to get trained in here. This is all available online. We could teach you in half an hour and everybody would improve by 75%, but we have more things to talk about.
And there's a self-instructional tool on the internet called a micro-expression training tool, or MET. Because although people love learning it in a class, it's dull as hell to teach. And you don't need to have it in class. You can learn it all on your own. And within an hour, you'll see things you didn't see before. You'll see concealed emotions. Cops love it. And they love it. Initially they start out, what does any professor have to tell me? Well, that work is really popular among law enforcement because recognizing the emotions that are being concealed can sometimes save a life. And if it can't save a life, it can certainly make an interview or an interrogation a lot more effective. It can give you the tools to enter what it is that the person you're talking to is either reluctant to tell you, or the other interesting thing about it is, if you are repressing your emotions, so you don't know how you feel, micro-expressions will occur. And you can't tell from the micro-expression whether it's the result of repression or suppression. Is it the result of a conscious attempt or unconscious attempt? It's exactly the same. But at least you know it's happening. The concealment is occurring and you know what's being concealed, and then through your clinical interviewing skills, you can find out whether it's due to repression or suppression. But it's a real step forward.
It's a superpower to learn it, so use it wisely. I often use it on friends and loved ones. They don't love it, but I think it's for their own good. Questionable.
I've never used it on my daughter or my wife. I see a lot that I never say anything about. And actually, there's a serious point here. When you've learned how to see micro-expressions, you've learned how to invade someone's privacy without their permission. So you have to do it carefully. Now, I've suggested to cops that the Fifth Amendment says they don't need to say anything. They've got the right to not reveal, that you should offer them a mask to wear so that they can hide their feelings from you. Otherwise, you're going to invade their privacy without their consent. You can't do it verbally. Should we be really allowed to do it non-verbally? Cops don't like that particular suggestion, but it's fun to raise because it just points out what you can do with this tool and the care you need to take, I believe. And those of you, and I doubt we have, are there any people from law enforcement in the room?
Undercover.
Okay, well, listen guys, clinicians, and there were a number of you are either students or practicing clinicians, your privacy is something you have to respect. And now I've claimed that if you have the right as a physician or a nurse to put your fingers in various orifices of the body, then you surely have the right to read the emotions. But most of you are not physicians. But people are coming to you asking for help. You just ought to make clear what it is you're going to try to do, and that you may sometimes see how they're feeling, even if they're ambivalent or didn't really feel comfortable with revealing how they're feeling. You can't turn it off. That is, once you learn, and you'll learn it in about 40 minutes from a self-instructional tool, once you learn how to see micro-expressions, you can't not see them. You'll see them all the time. What you can do is not talk about them unless you think you've been given permission to. I don't think in 37 years of marriage I've ever commented on a micro-expression of my wife's, but I've taken account of them.
We'll have her in the Q&A later, giving commentary. The next phase we're going to talk about is how someone whose main focus was on the science of emotion and psychology became affiliated with the Dalai Lama, who's a spiritual figure, not a scientist. And I think it would be putting it lightly to say my dad was somewhat suspicious of what meeting this spiritual figure might actually benefit. I had an interest in His Holiness the Dalai Lama and moreover just the social justice plight of the Tibetan people when I was in high school. I took a trip to Nepal and with an awesome high school teacher who gave us the opportunity to spend a week in a refugee camp and doing some service work there, and it really inspired me and motivated me to hear about this figure, this non-violent, peaceful figure who reminded me so much of Martin Luther King and other heroes I'd read about, and this person was alive, doing this work. My dad was invited to have part of a conference called the Mind and Life Institute conferences that Western scientists come and speak with the Dalai Lama on topics of science, kind of an interchange. He came so that he could bring me.
Right. If it hadn't been for Eve, I would not have gone at all. Okay, what might you do? I'm a scientist. Why waste your time talking to a spiritual leader? I don't talk to Christian spiritual leaders, I don't talk to Jewish spiritual leaders. Why should I talk to this one? This was the reason why.
But then, the meeting was phenomenal. It was a 359 degrees change there of watching the intellectual interest and then personal relationship develop between my dad and the Dalai Lama, and really sparked this interest that they had this shared cause. Let's help people work with their emotions. And anybody in academic psychology knows that after as many years as my dad spent working, you can really actually become unmotivated to try to help people anymore. It's so hard to get research out there. It's so hard to get published. There's so many critics. And the Dalai Lama, he was just about to retire. The Dalai Lama inspired him to create an entire training program in Western psychology and Eastern contemplative practices. This is now much more common, but we're talking about 16 years ago. And the program they created was Cultivating Emotional Balance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The next thing I'd like to show you is a small clip in which you see the Atlas of Emotion mentioned. This is coming from my dad's website. There's a lot of these webisodes online, so you can, there's 18 of these little stories here.
The Dalai Lama said that in the 21st century, we must find out how to achieve a calm mind, and our approach must be secular.
My thinking is that our target, calm mind, because the calm mind is directed to the peace of mind. And calm mind, I think, the 24 hours, including dreaming, calm mind is and 10 minutes in life. Compassion, 24 hours, I don't think. So occasionally, in practical level, when some disturbing mosquito comes, but there's sometimes you need a little extra. But still, you see, that kind of action is tempting while your mind very calm.
Yes, I think there's a distinction you're making between a continuous state, a calm mind,
Yes.
and a capacity that can be called forth when an event requires it, like compassion. Compassion isn't there continuously, but when you see suffering or anticipate suffering, then the compassion emerges. And if I understood you correctly yesterday, I'm not sure I did, but if I did, then if you have a calm mind,
it is more likely that the compassion will emerge when called for. Yes? Well, that also yes. Calm mind, you can see things more realistically, more objectively, more vivid, or vivid to say it. But now it's a mindful approach is now question how to develop calm mind. The real obstacle or destroyer of calm mind is fear, suspicion, hatred, anger, greed, too much ambition. These things are the destroyer of calm mind. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, according to the map of emotion, these are the opposite of calm mind. Now here you need self-confidence. More self-confidence, less fear. And then also objective mental attitude, greed, also less. And anyway, material value, there's limitation. Even your own world, the greed, never satisfied. Still want Mars, moons, or these things. So in material field, in any way, no, but there is limitation. So in that field, better content. Now I have this much. Oh, okay. Use common sense. Object. And then another thing. It could from within you. This guarantee you be 100% happy person. No. A content. Much better.
So, I know all you want to do now is watch more of that. But we are going to move on, and it gives you the seeds of where this map idea came from.
But on my website are 18 other episodes like that you can take a look at whenever you feel like it.
And I think what you see here is the Dalai Lama saying you don't need to want a spiritual life to invest in a calm mind. Everybody wants a calm mind, even a millionaire, which in Palo Alto, I think you guys have them. We started even in San Francisco these days. That doesn't necessarily mean you have calmness. It doesn't mean you can see things clearly. So this isn't just something that people want who don't have a lot of resources, or people want who are suffering from trauma. All of us want this calm mind. And with all of this expertise and practice from the Buddhist tradition, he still thinks that the scientific explanation and visualization of a map of emotions is going to be a very solid way to get there.
I just have to add the footnote that the Dalai Lama believes in the value of science more than I do. And if you can't prove it scientifically, he's very uncertain about it. A lot of them, I'd have to doubt a lot of my experience with the Dalai Lama, which I can't prove scientifically. So science is very good for discovery and for proof. Those are totally different types of scientific activity. But it's not the be-all and end-all. But I think strategically, the Dalai Lama believes that if you can put science behind it, then people will pay attention to it in the West. And he's probably right about that. But that's what legitimates some of the Buddhist views, if you've got scientific evidence for its benefit.
So before we get into the atlas, just a tiny bit more background on the lesser-known Dr. Ekman. So I wanted to let you, so it's, all relative here. So I was, relatives here also. I went to UC Berkeley and did my MSW there, which is a Master in Social Work. My interest at that point was really in serving the underserved and helping populations who need it the most. And boy, did I get it. I enjoy crisis work. So there may be other people in the room whose clinical practice is that way. I did child mental health crisis, I did emergency room crisis work, and was very interested in how to support people doing that work. Because every day I showed up in the ER, and if it was just it being a difficult work environment that created stress and burnout, every single person would have been burned out. And in fact, some people were, and you knew who they were. It was very clear. But the majority showed up with all this integrity and compassion on a daily basis. And it was really inspiring. And even those people who were able to sustain that compassion and integrity, they needed more support than they were getting. When I went back to school, my initial idea was to do a study on compassion within this emergency room setting. At that time, it was not as exciting to study compassion. I was there at a little bit of the wrong time. And I decided to move more towards empathy, which had more of a scientific basis and definition, somewhere I could kind of really hang my nail and look forward. And what became interesting to me was how to support people managing the fatigue of empathy as they work in these high-stress clinical environments. I'm sure many of you in this room have had days or months or maybe even years where it was hard to get through your everyday work with clients. Your emotional exhaustion was overwhelming. And my interest and my research has been in supporting folks working in these care environments. So I did my dissertation in a juvenile jail, working with the officers there. And now currently at UCSF, my primary research is with residents. So these are physicians in training. I would love to be working with psychologists and social workers, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and the whole gamut. But starting with residents is useful in that they're already in a training condition, and they're potentially the most stressed out professionals I've ever met. Their schedules and the demands on their time really overwhelm them, and it's just been a great opportunity to try to support them in the ways that I can. And so that's my current work. Cultivating Emotional Balance, this training that came out of that year 2000 meeting with the Dalai Lama and my dad, is a training that now has happened for the last 7 years in, I think, 6 different countries. We've never done it in the US, but starting in 2017, we will have a teacher training in Santa Cruz. And the training is 2 weeks of emotional skills, 3 weeks of silent meditation. So there's a lot of people who don't opt in, as you might imagine. And 5 weeks is a long time. But we've had now 250 graduates from over 25 countries who are teaching with children, teaching in prisons, teaching in hospitals, teaching in corporate settings, and they find the benefit of these 2 wisdom traditions together. Cultivating Emotional Balance teacher training is Alan Wallace, who's a Buddhist scholar and a writer, and myself teaching there together. This will be our 7th year, this year in Spain, not bad. Though honestly, I only see the inside of retreat centers for 5 weeks. Wherever they are, it's so wonderful, the people who show up. And you know, there's some stuff online. There's a course being taught right now at the Osher Center where I work. Osher Center is a integrative medicine clinic and research center that's kind of nestled in UCSF. And that's a little bit about what I do. I never thought I was going to follow in the footsteps of my dad, not because it didn't look interesting, but just because there was already someone doing it. And I think, as my dad said, there's a lot of ways life intervenes. The first Cultivating Emotional Balance training, I was supposed to come as an observer. I was just excited to go to Thailand where it was being held. And unfortunately, he had a health incident and made him not able to fly. So there I was, teaching. And it was wonderful. So my trajectory has been a little bit as well towards the opportunities that have come in front of me. And it's been pretty awesome so far. So now we're going to share with you a bit more about the Atlas itself and its scientific basis. So as you heard the Dalai Lama say, and that video was taken probably 6 years before even a formal request to make this atlas was made. He's been talking about this atlas or map of emotions for as long as we've been in contact with him, so at least 16 years, probably longer. And at one point, and I'm not sure why, but my dad was like, we gotta do this. I think there'd been a donation.
Danny Goldman told me he's talking about it so much. Wherever he goes, he talks about this map of emotions. So you better do one. That's why it happened, because he was really committed to it. And I recently considered what did I accomplish in 50 years of research, and almost all of it were following up on things that other people asked me to do. They weren't my ideas to begin with, but I was the one who took them and did something with them. And that was the case here because of his relentless demand for it. And I think, we don't really yet know. No one has yet done the research to show that the Atlas of Emotion is of any benefit to anyone. We hope people will. We think it's going to be a benefit. You'll see whether it's a benefit to you in your own personal life and take a look at it.
So the way that the Atlas started was a meeting in 2014 in June, was it 2014? In February. And then immediately following that, my dad created a brief survey of emotion scientists. The idea being, why not base this on what people commonly agree on instead of what we agree on, which is most things. And we sent it out, was it 248 scientists, 60% responded, and the questions were on some fundamentals of emotion. Have many people in this room studied emotion, psychology of emotion? Okay, some people. You've all felt emotions? Yes, great. So you're an expert already. There's, as many fields, it's contentious. There's a lot of debate, not a lot of coming together, which I actually think we will find more coming together as we have more evidence and better tools to measure and understand emotion. So the idea with this survey was to really base it on what the majority of scientists agreed on. So you see here, 88% agreed there are universal emotions. There are these emotions that are not only universally experienced, but have a universal signal, and that is quite unique.
Yes, this was a survey of 248 scientists whose primary work at that time was emotion. I was really surprised there were that many people studying emotion.
And 80% believe that these facial signals were unique. This is a published article online, so I don't know if you can easily access it, but if you know someone at a university, obviously, they can get you the PDF.
It's on my website.
Oh, and it's on his website. It's probably illegal, so we won't tell APS. There was agreement about anger, fear, disgust, sadness, and happiness or enjoyment, as we end up calling it in the Atlas. And yet there wasn't over 50% agreement on any other. So a lot of people feel a little concerned, and their first question, why isn't love there? What about shame? What about awe or guilt? Those are emotions. Unfortunately, over 50% of scientists do not agree that they are universal.
They don't believe that the evidence is convincing as yet. Over time, this should change. But right now, this is what the consensus is that there is overwhelming evidence for. And so that's what we chose to focus on.
But what's funny is you have just this general understanding or knowledge. Inside Out, though they had my dad as a consultant, they chose these as well without this survey. So there was definitely some common knowledge about which emotions to choose that would be the most resonant for people. Then there was aspects of emotions that are called triggers. Many of you are familiar with this idea of trigger, but is there something universal to what makes us angry, to what makes us sad, to what makes us feel happy? So you see here over 50% agree that there are these universal triggers. There is a physiology of emotion. People are not as enthusiastic, meaning something changing in the body, universally different and specific to these emotions. I won't go into all of it. It gets a little wonky if you're not an emotion scientist, and it didn't look like there was a lot in the room. Happy to take questions on that. The collaboration of this atlas was my dad, myself, and who you see here in the room, Eric Rodenbeck, and his designers from Stamen. These are cartographic map makers. They do visualizations of information. They had never visualized a concept before. To say it was hard would be an incredible understatement. We had no idea where to begin to think of representing something that wouldn't be false. So if we show emotion as a cylinder, do people think emotions are then round? If we show triggers as a point, people think that they're an axis that we're showing. So we had to be very careful at not overstating through visual. And what we didn't want was to create an online text. You can already read a book about emotion. We wanted something that could evoke through images this learning and this knowledge. Anything else on that process? It was tiring. It took us a couple of years, and we really were motivated by these ongoing meetings that we had with the Dalai Lama to show him our progress. In some of those meetings, he was really engaged, and that's usually when it was a hard copy book of the atlas that he could look at. When we showed him a screen, he was like, who cares? He appreciates and recognizes that screens are worthwhile, but for him was not a worthwhile interface, so that was learning for us. So we're gonna take you on a little tour here of the atlas. So here's how you get there online. Gives you a little introduction and some ways that you can investigate it. So in the Google Analytics, what we are able to see about who has come to this atlas, 480,000 people have visited, which is pretty great. Hopefully more to come. The majority of them, which emotion do you guys think that what was the #1 emotion people visited? Anger. Yes, just like, so here we go. The public speaks. So what you see here is a continent level view of emotion. These are the basic continents, which has a metaphorical kind of resonance to this idea of an atlas or a map. Here we are with continents and this map, and these are the primary families of these agreed upon emotions that over 50% of the scientists endorse. And we really want to keep it simple. We didn't want, at every single time we were looking at the text, we were reducing the amount of words. Well, how can we say this in the most pithy way? So, we are angered by interference, something getting in our way. I teach a lot of workshops on emotion, and when I ask people to give me an emotion episode of anger, the #1 response, anybody guess?
Tracking.
Yeah, what gets in your way? Other people. Which is so interesting, because even though we're angered by interference, and every emotion has a very functional purpose, right? Anger helps motivate us to remove that interference. But when we're driving, anger doesn't help remove the interference at all, unless you have a monster truck. And that might lead to something not as constructive in the end. So we see anger here, and the next thing we want to do is look at not just this one continent, but all of the different states of anger. So you see them here described in their levels of intensity. So we come with annoyance. It's a very mild anger. People often they're like, no, I don't have anger. It's not something for me. I'm like, really? How about annoyance? They're like, oh yeah, all the time. And I think that sometimes there's this attribution that anger is, we shouldn't feel anger. Anger is a negative or bad emotion. Anger is a very real and important emotion, and as we saw in the last couple of weeks, anger can meaningfully motivate us to social justice and to speak out. And anger can make us react in very unthoughtful and dangerous ways. It doesn't surprise me that people visit anger so often. When people have trouble with their expressions of anger, meaning they express more than they want to, there's so much regret and shame, and there's so much damage that can be done. So I'm not totally surprised that anger is this page that people really are seeking more understanding and more interest here. So then we have something large here like vengefulness, and you see that you can have like mild to intense vengefulness, but you don't have a little bit of vengefulness, right? And here we're not basing this on the scientific understanding of where vengefulness exists in our amygdala. Like, we don't have that level of scientific tool to measure it. We are giving our best estimation from what we know and from what we see. Our hope and goal is to also translate this into Spanish and Portuguese. And of course, that will mean that there's different names to these emotions. They're not all the same, yet they are describing similar phenomena.
And that goes back to documents that are 2,000 to 3,000 years old to find at least the 5 emotions that there's the strongest consensus about scientifically. They exist in all the documents. Sometimes naming them, combining 2 emotions rather than 1, but they're always there.
And then next we look at what are the ways that these states leads to various actions. So our emotions are a felt experience, and they're a way that we interact with the world, right? And are responding to something important in our environment. So vengefulness or argumentativeness, you see there's different likely actions. Again, this isn't, we know for sure if you feel frustration, one of these will happen. This is our best guess from what our automatic reactions are. Now, I'd say one of the only main points of debate we had was I wanted to put into these actions some of our more reparative responses, like taking a breath or having perspective. And my dad was saying these are not necessarily your automatic reactions. Those are more reparative and secondary. So those we do have, intrinsic or intentional. So the intentional ones are maybe what we apply to our feelings of emotion. And what you see highlighted here is we have this enormous annex of the atlas. Everything we couldn't fit in, but we thought people should also be aware of. Every time you see it highlighted, you can go to this page. Here are these other ways that people have intrinsic or conscious intent with different emotion experiences. So that's kind of how we get back there. Go back to this main page. I'm sure there's a better way to get there. So with these different actions of emotion, one of the important things we wanted to have people understand is no emotion in and of itself is good or bad, positive or negative. In fact, any emotion can be enacted in a way that's constructive or destructive. And if there's nothing else you remember from today, that would be wonderful. I really think we can get into this loop of, oh, I shouldn't have felt that way. Why did that make me angry? It shouldn't matter. Okay, maybe it shouldn't make you angry, and maybe it shouldn't matter. Was your response constructive, or was it destructive? Were you able to take that frustration or anger and either decide not the right time, or act in a way that protected yourself, that did manage to work? So that's some of the ways we want people to start thinking about their actions.
Just to add a couple of things, the criteria that the Dalai Lama and I came up with for distinguishing between constructive and destructive is whether the way in which you acted furthered or interfered with collaboration with that person. We're social animals. We can't really exist, most of us, alone. We need to be able to work with other people, whether they're our friends or our coworkers or our children or our parents or our spouses. It's other people. And if we act in such a way that interferes with it, then it's destructive. If it enables it, if it enables further collaboration, then it's constructive. And we had a very good time coming up with that, and both of us really liked it. Think it works generally. And emotions, if they weren't useful, we wouldn't have them. They wouldn't have survived. But we have this repertoire, which we've underestimated because we've only taken the ones and described for which there's the most evidence. But that'll change. This atlas shouldn't be the same 10 years from now. It should have more continents and more states.
And then just 2 more pages here I'd like to show you. This is triggers. So this helps us understand that emotions unfold over time. If we feel sad, it's not as though that just kind of bubbled to the surface. Sadness, right? There was a trigger to our sadness. That trigger is often an event in the outside world, but might have to do with our perception, our appraisal, the way we see it. There's a lot to get into with this subject. Well, our main goal was to give people that awareness that what triggers us might not trigger others, and yet there are these universal triggers as well. So here are these things we share, here are these ways that we are different. In fact, not only what we become emotional about, but how we become emotional can be quite unique. So for some of us, our highest level of anger is someone's lowest level of anger, right? So the thresholds at which we are maybe something like a set point, right? Of what we can, how we become emotional. So that doesn't mean that someone, sometimes we can't believe that someone could not react more strongly. And it could literally be that their set point is, oh, that's annoying. I walked out of the building at the hospital just 2 weeks ago with a colleague. We got to the front door and he said, my bike has been stolen. And I was like, who are you? Are you like sleep deprived or on drugs? And and I asked him about it the next week and I said, I couldn't believe how calm you were. He said, what could I do about it? I knew there was nothing I could change. And I was like, you are my teacher. Most people in that would be like, who didn't do this or why? Or, just going straight to anger. And his reaction was, okay, moving on. And so I was very impressed. And I imagine that he maybe had a really good breakfast and a good night's sleep and had all these lead-ups that allowed him that.
We differ in what I'm calling our emotional profile. How quickly we become emotional, how strong our emotions are, and how long it takes for them to decay over time. We don't really know the extent to which that's biological or psychologically determined. It's probably both. It doesn't seem like it's very amenable to change. It's worth, though, knowing what your profile is. Your profile for anger, fear, sadness, and disgust is entirely different than your profile for enjoyment. But it's like two separate systems. You want a good example of that? Look at our president. He goes from 0 to maximum of enjoyment in an instant. But his anger is very slow. I actually think those are good characteristics for a leader. You want the anger to be slow. The enjoyment, that's fast or slow, doesn't really matter. But for him, it's very fast. And our data shows the independence of these two systems. If you go to my website in about 2 months, you'll find a emotional profile tool that you can use free of charge to help you chart what your own profile is. And so we're nearly done with it, nearly done with the programming of it. But we each have a different profile. And your children probably have a better idea of what your profile is than you do. You and your spouse may have overlapping views of what your profiles are, but it's worth knowing. And those of you who are psychotherapists, there seem to be a number of them, can you change it? Is it amenable to change? In the ancient days when I was giving lectures and asking people questions like we're doing now, the questions that people ask is, how can I change what I become emotional about? That was number one. I had no answer for that. And two, how can I change how I behave when I am emotional? Well, there I think the key is awareness. And I don't know, are you planning to talk much about bringing awareness into emotion?
I think this whole talk is about bringing awareness into emotion. Okay, awareness into emotion. Again, any way in which we can understand our triggers, our states, our contents, all of these aspects are giving us this language, this place to understand and reflect on our experience. Where we are unlikely to bring awareness into the picture is when we are already emotional. Maybe, with a lot of practice, you can start to become aware of how emotional you are before you react. But for most of us, it's our pre-work and our post-work. How are we preparing ourselves to manage responses to emotion? And then after we've had an experience of emotion, can we look back and consider, what was triggering me? Was there a way I could have prevented or avoided? Is there something in the future I might take notice of so I don't react in a regrettable way? So emotion awareness is just drawing this attention to our experiences of emotion. Many strategies to do that. This one of just basically understanding and familiarizing I think never gets old. You're never going to graduate out of recognizing what emotion you're feeling, what it might lead to, where it came from.
Emotions evolved to solve problems without thought. That can be in your service or it can get you into a lot of trouble. So if you're going to introduce awareness into the experience of emotion itself, that's going to take a lot of work, because even to become aware afterwards is a bit of work. I suggest to people that they keep a diary of regrettable emotional episodes. So that, you know, every couple of weeks you can take a look and see what's common. What are the kinds of things that are getting me into regrettable episodes? Okay. We all act in ways that afterwards we think, oh, you know. I love the expression, I lost my head. What does that tell us? I lost my head? What you're really saying is, I wasn't thinking about what I was doing, and if I had, I would have done it differently. Okay. But that's the nature of emotion. It's to do it for you without your thinking about it ahead of time. Much of the time that saves your life, makes life enjoyable or useful, but it gets us into trouble also.
I'm getting ready to want questions from you guys. I'm realizing we could probably keep going on. I'm going to show you briefly that there are two other views here. We have moods that talk about this really difficult experience of having a prolonged emotional feeling that is actually not triggered by something, but more amorphous. We know very little about moods, but you'll see an example of them, like an irritable mood for every emotion. And you'll see our destination. Calm. How many different screens we had to try and show this. The idea was, with calmness, the emotions arise and they fall without us holding on to them, without us getting caught in them. We create, exactly as the Dalai Lama said in the video, this spaciousness. A calm mind, anything can arise and we can respond and then come back to calmness. It's the background. The last thing that we are going to show you here is just a little bit about where to find the Atlas of Emotion, the Inside Out information online. So once again, on the website, my dad published a parent's guide for Inside Out. So it's all there. We are happy to answer questions, but just as like an example, it's a little PowerPoint narrated slideshow talking about how Inside Out considers memory, how that contradicts to maybe what we already know about memory and emotion together. We're happy to answer specific questions on this, but we'd like to hear them from you. Okay, we're going to move to the stage to talk about our future directions here. Research, training, clinical work, how we use this for specific populations, children, emotional disturbances, couples and families. We really want to thank you for your attention. One of our fun meetings with His Holiness. And really, thanking also Tom and thanking the CTI and Cafe for having us. We are so happy to be here with you guys, and this makes our work meaningful to be here with you and hopefully hear your questions as well.
It's really, this was your idea, not mine. We're open to questions.
I'm wondering what kind of a reward system, in your opinion, knowing human beings and the fact that in order to control or change a certain behavior after you feel an emotion, there needs to be a reward system as well. If you can talk a little bit about if you have done any research or if you've come across anything that you could share with us as far as that, in order to make this more of a universal practice, and how that's possible. Thank you.
Do you understand the question? Let me see if I understood it. Describing like an alternative reward system, which feels to me more in like the CBT or DBT framework. I don't think there is any opposition between that and a more overall view of emotional awareness. I do think, especially coming from the lens of cultivating emotional balance, in which simultaneously you're learning this new language, identifying your emotions. You're also learning to attend to your mind and create these experiences where you realize, wow, without these extreme intense emotions, my mind is kind of a nice place to be. And it's a subtle reward. It's a subtle reward. And so I think CBT could be a nice framework where people are having these specific objectives, it's CBT cultivating, cognitive behavior therapy for those who are not familiar. When you have a structure that allows people to see what are my goals, how am I reaching them? And I also think these goals of just peace of mind or calmness, as is the objective of the Atlas, can be achieved through mind training, aka meditation or mindfulness. So, mind training, if you want to teach it to people who don't want it, meditation or mindfulness to people who already know they want it. Thank you for the question.
I have two questions that have sort of evolution as its basis. So the first, you commented that love kind of didn't get that consensus, which surprised me. I would have thought love and let's say protecting offspring at all costs has a survival benefit for the genetic investment. So be interested in your take first on first question around why it didn't make it the cut as one of the continents. And the second evolutionary question was right at the beginning, micro emotions. And
let's take questions one at a time.
Sure. Yeah,
so
go ahead.
The first you can ask the second. The love is are you talking about my love of my spouse or my children? That generally is considered in the realm of attachment. Or are we talking about my love of country, my love of work? Love doesn't tell you anything. It's just a word that it doesn't specify, unless it specifies the target. And once it specifies the target, there are better words to use to describe what you're after. But the emotions can come and go in a matter of seconds. If love comes and goes in a matter of seconds, it isn't love. I love my daughter. That doesn't mean I don't get angry with her, that I'm not afraid of the fact that she rides a bicycle in the city of San Francisco. I have lots of emotions because of my attachment to her and my commitment. I prefer to use, instead of love, for those kinds of situations, attachment and commitment. That gives you a better idea as to what's going to occur. But it's, I was delighted that other emotion scientists, and there were 248 people, that they didn't consider love an emotion either. Which, if it's not an emotion, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just not in that narrow class of emotions. You have a second question.
Yeah, thank you. That was interesting. So the second one, also evolution, and it goes back to the micro expressions. You described it as a superpower, which seemed appropriate description. In fact, so much so, you'd think if you were really good at it, there'd be an evolutionary advantage. There's a survival advantage. So why aren't we neurally hardwired to just be absolute experts and we don't need the training?
I've written about that somewhere on my website, because it's puzzled me also. Less than 5% of people get the information from micro-expressions without any special training. And yet, with under an hour's training, everybody can get it. So it's learnable. So why do we need to learn it? Well,
my guess is if before we had language, we were all a lot better at it.
Well, you could test that by seeing whether or not other primates, which don't have language, are good at spotting microexpressions. I'll bet they aren't. But who knows?
Who knows? I think I bet we just stop favoring it. It's not something we need to learn. We need to learn it again. It's something that we naturally have, and we favor what people are saying. We're listening to their words. We're not watching their faces much.
I think you're right to some extent, but I think it's more than that. And I think if you looked at pre-verbal kids, they wouldn't be very good at microexpressions either. But, you know, they're...
Empirical question.
It is. Somebody should find out. Not me. Another question. Yes, over there.
I hope I can pose this right. The pre-verbal, you talked about symbols. I'm wondering about the expressions of emotions with pre-verbal. I mean, are they the same, or are they developed?
Pre-verbal meaning children, or pre-verbal cultures?
Oh, well, there's still a bit of argument about when each emotion appears, but certainly all of the emotions except for contempt are evident in the first year of life, and with the same expression and the same vocal characteristics. So the signals are there early. Contempt is a moral judgment. I'm better than you. I look down upon you. That doesn't really appear until 3 to 5 years of age. So that's the last one to appear. But you don't need words for emotions, but you need words if you're going to think about your emotions, which is a uniquely human capacity as best we know. That is, we can think about things that we're not feeling at the moment, things that happened yesterday. We can imagine. John Lennon's song immediately came to mind.
First thing I want to say, I'm really impressed by your work, and I hope many Chinese population can have more awareness to those emotions. And I guess my question is about around your question, how to cultivate emotional awareness. Is more like you learn the atlas of emotions, then you sort of have a label to understand different aspects, different categories of emotions. Or is it more about the moments-to-moment cultivation, like meditative process? So you have an awareness to what's happening to your inner world. And also curious about the idea of compassion you just mentioned about. How does the role of compassion play in cultivating emotional awareness? Thank you.
Beautiful question. Thank you. I'll start. Let's see. I do think in the same way that if you are a physician and you're studying a textbook, and your textbook has a list of all the ways that the symptoms for a flu manifest, and you read them, okay, it's this cough, okay, oh right, they might be sweaty, there might be a fever, they might have fatigue, so you learn them, you identify them, and then when you see someone in the world, you can apply that knowledge. So this knowledge here is meant to be used in the real world laboratory. And I'm sure you all know, but the amount of emotions that occur even before you've had coffee, especially before you've had coffee, profound, right? You can use your life for this work. And I do think that the meditation or bringing mindfulness to emotions specifically can be a great practice for developing emotional awareness. You're remembering to keep in mind what's going on for you emotionally.
We have to remember that we're biased observers of ourselves. Okay? We have preconceptions that we want to maintain, and things about ourselves that we don't want to believe. So we want to try to bring in other people's views of ourselves to the extent to which we can. People who don't have an axe to grind that they want to cut our head off with. But it might be useful for us. But also, I mentioned earlier, keep a diary keep a diary of the emotional episodes where I really feel good about how I handled that. And keep another diary of the ones that are regrettable. See what you can learn by looking at that diary, both of those diaries. You can teach yourself a lot by just simply reflecting on what it is you've done. These things pass very quickly, we forget about them.
And I think in the second part of your question, the reason you need compassion for this is you start, if you are an honest observer and if you have observations from those around you, you can start to feel a lot of regret. And I think one of the first experiences for many people who start meditation or any mindfulness practice is, my mind is a garbage dump. And that includes both our thoughts and our emotions. So learning that skill to accept who you are, as you're learning to identify and hopefully reach some state of calm, absolutely important. Not like let yourself off the hook. Anything I feel is okay. Yes, I was totally rude, but it's okay, I have compassion for myself, but more to reduce our kind of spiraling into regret, which might not allow us to repair or make better plans for the future. Question way in the back.
Is there a specific emotion that you felt was left out of like the continents in the atlas that you guys felt either should have been or should have been included?
A lot of them, and the two that have interested me the most, because of my work with law enforcement and national security, are guilt and shame, which are, if you're interviewing someone that you suspect of a crime, you want to magnify guilt and reduce shame, okay? Shame will prevent them from telling you because they think you'll be disgusted with them. But guilt will motivate them to tell you, so they'll get some relief from it, sharing it and acknowledging their regret. So these work in opposition to each other. And there are interview strategies you can use, which I used to teach, to magnify guilt and reduce shame, particularly with child molesters, which is a shameful thing to do. So who's going to tell you about the fact that they're molesting children? But there are ways you can help them reduce the shame or deal with the shame they feel for having failed in this regard, and let the guilt motivate confession. Confession is what you're after when you do an interview. Not a false confession, and that's a terrible problem, because there are some people who will confess the things they never did. They imagine they might do them, or then lost the distinction between what they fantasized and what they actually did do. I have that problem sometimes in conversations. I'll think of something I want to tell my daughter, and I'll have a whole conversation in my head, including her response to it, wonderful responses she gives. And then I think I've had it, but I haven't had the conversation. It's all in my head. Trying to remember that is really important. And when it comes to guilt and shame, those are really important. Those are the two that I think are most critically missing because of their impact on social life. They're critical for our self-regulation and for our dealing with others and a whole bunch of problems. Do you have another one that you...
Were they close to being included, or were they were your colleagues?
He asked, were they close? How close were they percentage-wise? And I can't remember. It's on the survey. On the survey.
I don't remember either, but they sure didn't get up there very high. And I thought, the survey asked for you to say, is there incontrovertible evidence for the existence of this emotion? Well, there hasn't been that much research on some emotions. That doesn't mean that there won't be. Hopefully there will be. And that's why I think this is a list that's going to change over time. It's not an unlimited list. There aren't thousands of emotions. There's a limited number. I'll bet you it's under 15. Except in one of my books, I think Emotions Revealed, I think I described 16 different kinds of enjoyment. Challenging the reader, do you actually experience all these different ways you could enjoy yourself? If you don't, try them out. Because there are lots of different ways you can experience enjoyment. More different ways you can experience enjoyment than fear. Certainly than disgust. Those are much more limited, narrow. But enjoyment, the word happy and the word enjoyment probably do us a disservice because it causes us not to be specific about what it is that we're specifying. They're very different. My favorite example is relief and excitement. I enjoy both. They are as different as anger is from sadness. They're really different emotions. They're both enjoyable.
So this dovetails off of your question, or what you just spoke to, but one of the things you said, almost in an offhand way that feels so important to me, is that emotions evolve to solve problems without thought. So therefore they are part of our evolution. And so what I noticed in those 5 is that anger, fear, disgust, and sadness we human beings might categorize as negative emotions. And so literally 80% of what you're offering is our negative side. I mean that in the most general sense. And only happiness only accounts for one of those major emotions. But
16 different types of
and that's what I think you're speaking to. Yeah, and so what you're saying then is that enjoyment has a much larger scope than those other 4.
Now think of it this way. I feel upset. Which kind of upset? Am I afraid? Am I angry? Am I disgusted? Am I sad? You don't know. I just said upset. I feel happy. You don't know which one it is. So think of happy and upset as the opposite terms that gloss over and ignore what specific emotion is occurring. They don't tell you. You have to find out.
But if you're asking, which you might be kind of what do we feel on a daily basis?
No, I'm not asking that. I'm asking how are those 4, well, I'm asking several questions in one, so I apologize for that, but I'm asking anger, fear, disgust, and sadness. How do those all contribute to our evolution? Fear, yes, I get, but the others, disgust, how do those contribute to our evolution? And then enjoyment, how does that contribute to our evolution? I'm just curious.
Well, in my book, Emotions Revealed, I've talked about these things at more length, and it's a paperback. So I only get 50 cents, so not much conflict about putting it out. But without disgust, we probably wouldn't survive, because disgust is what causes us to avoid toxic substances, or at least not to eat them twice if we throw up the first time, okay? If we can't stand the smell of it. A lot of rotten things smell bad and are disgusting by odor, and it warns us away from it. So disgust is enormously useful. One of the things that Inside Out, I think, misrepresented was sadness. Sadness is I think of each emotion as having a message. Sadness says, come help me, I need help. And if I didn't have sadness, nobody would know when I needed help. So it's a very important emotion. It's not to be disparaged as Inside Out did for no good reason. So each emotion has a message, it has a function. We wouldn't still have it if it wasn't there. It wasn't useful to us. Now, the odd thing is there are aberrations. There are I believe there are genetic aberrations for people who don't have all of the emotions that everyone else has. But they're very rare. They're natural experiments, not studied often enough.
Thank you.
So I know you
Billy
mentioned...
Lee. I'm an 84-year-old retired architect, and most of my life I've been working on how to provide environment, living spaces for human beings. And my whole base for my design basically is provide good feelings, which is really related to emotion and so on. And after retirement, I've been basically thinking about what is the meaning of friendship and the relationship you to yourself and you to other people. And recently I've been toying with this idea of promoting a international cross-cultural institute on what I call friendshipology. And what do you think of that?
Well, friendship are, a central part of all of our lives. And there are people that we trust. I just finished writing something about should we trust the police and should the police trust us because of all the recent stuff that's been occurring. But friends are people we do trust, that they will share, they have our best interests at heart to the same extent that we do, and we do for our friends. So you're not just friends with anyone, you have to share some values to be friends. Could I be friends with a murderer? Probably not. It's probably, certainly someone who murdered for fun, and there are such people, where their source of entertainment is murdering people. Would never be a friend. Do they have any friends? Is that why? It's lots of them. I'm sure there's a literature on friendship that must be profound. I just don't know it. Do you know it?
Belongingness. That's a little different. I love the idea of an institute on friendshipology. I do think emotions would be a big part of it. When to use what you're recognizing of an emotion from your friend constructively, when to let them continue to do things that we might feel are harmful, but to hold that space for them. And yeah, as my dad was saying, you look at if you did track your daily emotions, which I'm a big fan of, and I'm undergoing a research study to track daily emotion, you look at what you feel on a daily basis and who you feel it about. Other people are at the root of the majority of our emotional experiences, either them interacting with us or our perception of how they might respond.
Or our cell phones, not people. And that's one of the more unfortunate things. We see two people having dinner together, each one looking at their cell phone. They're not talking to each other. They're basically talking to their cell phone, but they're not talking out loud, so the other person can't hear it. So I think having a little computer in your pocket, which I do have one right here, it's a big problem. We haven't really learned an etiquette of how to deal with it. I can give you the warning that if you answer your cell phone while I'm with you, I walk away. That's the end of the interaction. I believe that we should give precedence to anybody present versus anyone on our cell phone. But that's not how I
Another question, I know there was one in the back. Yeah.
So I was recently part of a effort at a major medical center to train everyone from support staff through physicians at crisis de-escalation with their patients and clients and sort of recognizing when things are becoming heated through a series of short videos. So I was wondering if either of you in your work with law enforcement or on crisis situations have used micro expressions to train people in to recognize crisis situations and de-escalate them before they become severe, and how something like that would look like if you haven't done it before.
Sure, it sounds like I think it's great to train everyone, and it sounds like that was a good exercise with the videos, and it would probably just be a very subtle pivot to focus on the emotion expression. And I think not just in the face, but in the voice, as my dad was suggesting earlier, you can pick up a lot on what people are experiencing and hopefully intervene. It's very delicate to respond to people's emotions in a way that doesn't make them feel either kind of flattened or suffocated, oh, I see you're angry right now. It's oh, really? You see I'm angry? Right? So there's a way that might not help, even with our best intentions. And so I think, I'm not sure, I don't know of a succinct protocol, this is what always to do. And that's because there's so much idiosyncrasies among how people become angry or what makes them angry. Absolutely in crisis settings, I was so amazed at the variety of emotion expression and how people responded, right? Just my friend who responded to his bicycle being lost with oh. You see that people whose family member's life is in danger, whole variety of emotional experiences and intensities, what they need, what they want, touching or not touching. I did a small focus group with the family members of pediatric patients, and they meet on a monthly basis as an advisory council. And I asked them, what is empathy? What does it look like? And I haven't written it up, but it's amazing. One person says, when the doctor calls me by my first name. So often the doctor comes to me and says, how's mom doing today? This person hated that, didn't want to be called Mrs. So-and-so. Another person said, I want the doctor to come in and recognize me with like a hug. Other person said, I do not want them to touch me. And I think you find a variety. I think if you're training individuals to be aware of their emotional responses to others, and this gets back to just basic clinical training, can we be the barometer for another person's emotional experience? How much information will that give us? And that requires that we are aware of our emotional resonance or kind of contagion sometimes with others.
I spent most of my career as an outlier in a psychiatry department that was, for a good part of its time, very psychoanalytic in its orientation. Psychoanalysis has very little to say about emotion. And you know, the classical stance where the analyst sits behind the patient, can't see the patient's face. I used to ask my colleagues, why are they doing that? I think they're doing it for their own convenience so that the patient won't see their face or tell when their eyelids are drooping. You know, they're protected from the other person's gaze, but they're missing a lot of information. The response was, well, it'll eventually come out. Eventually? Do we want to wait for the eventual? When it's being broadcast right there. When I myself was a patient being analyzed, there were many times when I felt strong emotions, which I know registered on my face, but I could not bear to say them, expecting rejection if I did. And my analyst didn't see them, of course, because he was seated so he couldn't see them. And that still occurs in psychoanalysis, which is beginning to disappear. I think it'll end up just in museums. We can go and take a look at it.
So it makes sense from a rational standpoint that the emotions that we currently have are, you know, a product of evolutionary accumulation, right? So that begs the question, does altruism in its purest form innately exist, or is it fundamentally self-serving?
Ask Daniel Batson. No, I'm kidding. That's a famous altruism researcher that doesn't have so much to do per se with emotions, though I think it's an area of interest for my dad and I both. And we have researchers in the front row who could also speak to this. I think both and. Altruism feels good. We know that. Helping others feels good. Are we doing it to feel good? I'm not sure if we're consciously aware that we will feel good after until we familiarized ourselves. And many of us are just leaning in towards the person who needs our help.
Darwin said that is why we engage in altruistic behavior, because it's rewarding to us to do it. And the Dalai Lama agrees with that it is self-rewarding. But in some sense, it doesn't matter. What you see is altruistic behavior in toddlers, for example. Incidentally, it's less evident when they get to be about 4 or 5 years old than it is when they're 2 years old, in terms of going to that aid of someone in distress or anguish. And nobody knows why that's so, because the longitudinal studies are what we need the most of, but it needs to be dense. We need to be able to look at things month to month, if not week to week. Now, if you don't mind. I was going to write a book of sentences we don't want people to finish. That was one of them. If you don't mind. She certainly doesn't want me to finish that one. I videotaped Eve every day the first 2 weeks of her life. Of course without her consent, because she didn't know what the heck I was doing. But there was just enormous changes. I mean, one day versus another day, you know, to say that it's a first week versus a second week. No, there's a third day versus a second day versus the fifth day. There are huge changes, at least in the first couple of weeks of life where I was looking, and in the repertoire, in the responsiveness, and we, because the reward system is a corrupted one in the academic world, you get hired and promoted by the number of publications, not even the number of times your publication is cited, although that wouldn't be very useful since, you know, I cite most often the person I think is totally wrong. If you want to get the misimpression, please go to what so-and-so said. There's where you can get all the false information. So citations themselves, unless you look at how it's cited. But frequency of publication should be a reform that I attempted to institute and failed at. I should publish a list of my failed reforms. Was that only the last 5 things you published could be considered for either promotion or hiring. Think of what that would do to the publication system. Instead of trying to get 5 articles out of one study, you try to get 5 studies into one article. You reduce enormously the number of publications and you increase enormously their quality. But nobody's willing to do it. At least, you know, I tried Harvard and Yale and Columbia. Unless the big boys were to do it, no one else is going to do it.
Next question. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Tess, and I'm a hospice aide, so I'm taking care of 5 dying patients a day. And through that years, I believe that compassion is either we have it the day we born or not. I want your opinion.
Thank you for the work you do, first of all. And I think we are all born with it. Looking to my compassion researchers here, I think we are all born with it, absolutely. And I do think my personal approach and the theory that I work from in the work I do is that what gets in the way of our compassion is our empathy fatigue. And that's not just my belief. There are neuroscientists like Tanya Singer and James Dissetti who look at what happens with our fatigue, our empathy fatigue, when we don't know how to transform that into compassion and instead it rests in personal distress. So when we are faced with a lot of people who are suffering and struggling, there's this immediate emotional resonance. We're hardwired. If you saw me looking sad up here, don't you kind of feel sad for me? Right? You start to feel the emotion, the pull. So we have that resonance. And then with empathy, our challenge is, what do we appraise? What then do we think? Do we think, how can I help Eve? What does she need? Is she thirsty? Does she need a rest? Right? We have this idea, and sometimes those ideas or perceptions, especially if we're professional caregivers, we can feel this is too hard, this is overwhelming, it can be really exhausting. We can also go to this, especially unfortunately working in public health institutions where we don't have resources, I just can't help. Or that person doesn't even actually want my help, I'm not going to respond. So different ways that we respond in our appraisal can change whether or not our behavior is compassionate. Or we can learn a response with suffering of compassion, but that compassion can also be a feeling of overwhelm unless we realize that just having the compassion, what's called a stance of compassion, as opposed to an action of compassion, is enough. So if we think with every suffering person that we see, we have to do or give or offer, we will be overwhelmed. We'll have that fatigue of our empathy. Yet if we think that all of these people we see who are suffering, I wish them compassion. I wish. It sounds like a fantasy, right? Oh, I'm wishing. Okay, I wish for $1 million. I wish for this president candidate to win or not win. It sounds like a fantasy, but when I work, especially in the hospital settings, you face suffering. It is distressing. What are your options? Your options are suppress it, pretend you can't, just try to not feel it. Your options are lose yourself in their suffering. Oh God, they're suffering, this is so hard, the world is so messed up. Or acting, ideally, not always an option, I can do this thing to help them, great. And if you can't act, you can at least extend that compassion. It's an aspiration. And that training, I think, can be enormously beneficial. And even without a meditation background, my guess is when people encounter suffering that they can't help or fix, those who do feel successful do offer part of their intention or their aspiration. I care for that person. So that's the theory I base my work on, and the trainings I do. I think we'll see more and more evidence. There's a lot of people interested in this very specific area. Does that answer your question?
Well, most of us probably be working as a hospice aide if there's compassion literally. Because when people knew that I'm a hospice aide, there's that for me.
So So I'm sorry, so you think if everyone had compassion, they would do more to help others, maybe? Is that the idea?
Particularly for the dying people.
Yeah. I think, it's interesting, when I worked in the ER, people were like, you're a saint. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I just do this work. I could never do that. Of course you could. But I do think there's different ways that people feel empowered to help. I think everybody has the actual urge for altruism and helping others. People are called in different ways. What do you think?
Well, I think it's present in most people, but not to the same extent. Individuals differ. That should be said in italics. I mean, they're not all exactly the same. And in regards to emotions, particularly things as complex as compassion, the people sitting in this room aren't all the same in terms of how strongly they feel and how they act when they do feel it. And that's great. We need variation. That's the material for evolution to work with. Like variation, see what's going to work in this particular environment. And what works in one environment may not work in another environment. There's lots of different environments that even the people just sitting in this room working. We don't all work in the same setting. That doesn't make the same demands on you. You work in a lot of different settings that make different demands. Hopefully, you have found a setting that fits your settings. That is, that fits what your individual proclivities are and capacities are. If you haven't found it, then keep searching, because that's what's going to work best for you. But it's the same for everyone.
I think we only have a minute or two left, but I would also say there has been research on what's called exquisite compassion. And interestingly, though you have these phenomenally high rates of burnout in almost every subspecialty of medicine, in hospice care, there's less burnout. Why is that? I think there's an attention to that compassion and the limits of what you can do. Strange that knowing the limits of what you can do actually make you feel more empowered, more at ease, or less stressed out. But I do think if you think of what are the obstacles to compassion, it is a fear, right? Fear. I'm not going to be able to help, or it's going to be too hard. So working with that fear, probably one of the most important things.
Last question.
Hi.
Then from someone who hasn't asked a question.
Okay, hi. So there's obviously a great social and cultural expectation for females to be better at identifying an emotion. So I'm wondering if you guys have found that notion or stereotype really has manifested itself in your work. In other words, have you found that one group is better at identifying emotions, or if they identify emotions in a different way from the other group?
I have tens of thousands of data points on that, and I have no male-female difference that survives. There's so much variation among males and females, and there's so much overlap. However, what elicits the emotion? Big male-female differences. In some cultures, there's big differences between cultures in what elicits an emotion and in what you do when you feel the emotion. But in the emotion itself and in the recognition of it, this is something that I've gotten a lot of blowback from. But women do not recognize emotion more accurately than men. They just do different things about them once they recognize them than most men do. But that, again, depends on the culture. And that's changing enormously with time. So some of those differences are evaporating. But basically, any intact human being will recognize all of the emotions that we've been talking about.
Tom, should we wrap it up here? Oh, good.
Close to that. I just want to conclude by expressing gratitude, first of all, to Dr. Ekman and Dr. Ekman for being here. To the audience who joined us, you deserve applause as well. To the cafe students who organized this event and helped us. Appreciate Dr. Maureen O'Connor, who joined us today, our incoming president for PAU. Just a couple of weeks, we're going to have a new president. Thank you for joining us. And the last vote of gratitude is to the sturdy, physically able students who joined us and would like to help us bring some of this stuff back into our U-Haul truck. So if there's PAU students here who can help us, that would be fabulous. And really, thank you so much for joining us today. It's just a beautiful time spent together, so much appreciated. Thank you.
And thank you, Yotam, for arranging this and enabling this.
Yes.
Enjoy.
Thank you.